Hello and welcome back to What's Mili Making, where I am Mili and this is a space where I talk about the past, present, and future of my making. And today's video is Knitting Podcast episode 5. I know last time I asked for feedback on how I should and could incorporate sewing into these videos, and I really appreciate all the feedback. It's kind of a mood point today because I don't have any sewing to talk about. However, I have had the most productive month of knitting. This is actually the second time I'm recording this podcast. So initially I had two finished sweaters from the last month, which is a lot for me. But since then I actually have 3 finished sweaters, and I don't even think one of them I cast on after the last podcast. That was really quick knit. So without further ado, I guess let's just jump into those finished objects. So my first finished object is a sweater that has been on the needle, that was on the needles for basically exactly a year because it was a leap year. I checked my Ravelry notes. I cast the tessellated pullover by Andrea Mowry last year on July 14th, and this year I finished it on July 13th. I wasn't like actively working on it the whole time. There was very, very long gaps of time where I did not work on it, but it's okay because we finally made it. When I first cast it on, I thought maybe it would be a sweater I could wear for Rhinebeck. What a joke. I really lost all steam on this project. So this is a bottom-up construction drop shoulder sweater pattern. You seam it up at the shoulders. It is knit, I think, on 3.5mm needles, but I did size up to 3.75mm needles with sport weight yarn, 3 different yarns. I feel like I'm constantly repeating myself whenever I talk about this sweater, but I also don't want to assume that every single person watches every single episode of these podcasts. So I want to include the pertinent information. So if you already heard this multiple times, I'm sorry. And if you haven't, welcome. Okay, so as I was saying, this is knit with 3 strands of yarn, sport weight yarn, and it is all over mosaic knitting. So I think mosaic knitting is a great introduction to color work because you are only working with 1 strand of yarn at a time, and my first color project was actually a mosaic knitting pattern. I don't know if this specific pattern I would categorize as beginner friendly, maybe like adventurous beginner. The mosaic knitting does create a really, really pretty like slip stitch textured fabric, but it does take longer because you are, for every like row of length that you get, you basically have to work each row out like 2 or 3 times. That's why this sweater took me so long. That said, when I got into a groove with it, it was really, really rhythmic and really, really enjoyable. It's just that I think because it took it worked up so slowly that I would just lose steam. So like I would start knitting on it and really, really enjoy it, and then like after a few days I'd be like, I'm over it, and it would be packed away again. But we finally made it. We did it, Joe. We got there. So we talked a little bit about the construction. Let me talk now, I guess, about modifications that I made. First up, it starts off with a tubular cast on, which I absolutely loathe doing, especially when it is this many stitches. So instead I did an alternating cable cast on, and I think it came out really, really nice and clean looking. The other major modification I did is I extended the length of the yoke. So I've never knit an Andrea Mowry garment pattern before, but I have looked at like a lot of the project notes from some of her other popular patterns because I really like them and I would like to knit them at some point. And a common complaint seems to be that her yokes tend to be tight on some people and the upper arm circumference can be quite small. So knowing that, I did look into the schematics of this pattern, and then I compared it to other drop shoulders, like the schematics of other drop shoulders that I've knit and I enjoy the fit of, and this one was just much smaller than the other ones. Like I think I knit the size 4, and I think the upper arm circumference on this sweater, the size 4, which I think was like a large, was smaller or the same as extra small on some other drop shoulder schematics that I was looking at. So I knew I had to increase that upper arm circumference for it to fit comfortably around my arm. So I took better notes on my Ravelry page notes. I took better notes on my Ravelry project page on how I did it. But basically, after you knit the body and the round, you get to a point where you start knitting flat because you knit to the front and back separately. And at that point, I basically added, I think, 1.5 inches in length. So in total, it added 3 inches to the upper arm circumference of the sleeve. And I added that length before I started doing the neckline shaping, and now it fits me so much better. It is not a garment that has a ton of ease, but I'm okay with that because I'm planning on wearing it with like high-waisted skirts and pants. And I also have not blocked it yet, so I'm assuming it will grow a little bit when I block it. The reason I haven't blocked it yet is it's just been so hot and humid lately, and whenever I wash a sweater, it takes days to dry. And then on top of that, I'm just planning on packing this away. So it's gonna get wrinkly and will have creases, so I'm gonna wash it again when I take it out to wear in the fall, so it just kind of seemed wasteful to block it right now. So I set the needle size. Let's talk about the yarn that I used. So like I said, this uses 3 different yarns, and I used 2 of the 3 recommended yarns. So I subbed out the main yarn, which they recommend Spin Cycle Spinster's Daughter, which is like the same base as their Dyed in the Wool, which is their sport weight color shifting yarn, except Spinster's Daughter is tonal. And when I can, I prefer to knit with non-superwash wools versus superwash. Also, good wool is just like a fraction of the price of that yarn, and it also comes in a lot of great colors. And I also already had this in my stash because I had knit a sweater with it that I wanted to unravel. So yes, my main color was Pearl Soho Good Wool in the natural colorway. I really like it. It's like a loosely plied sport weight yarn. My one gripe with it is that on the project page it says it can be used in like up to DK and worsted weight projects, and I just don't think it can be. The fabric gets super holey, especially if you are just holding it as a single strand. I don't think it works, in my opinion. The other 2 yarns that I used are, I think, the recommended yarns in the pattern. So the pink, which is like the fluffy yarn, I used Moondrake Fua Fua in the shade Flamingo, which is a cashmere merino blend. It's like a light fingering weight yarn, you could say. Definitely thicker than a mohair, probably more similar to a suri. And then the color changing yarn I used is Spin Cycle Dyed in the Wool in the shade Verba Volant. And I used a little bit over 1 skein of the Fua Fua, and I had 2 skeins of this colorway of the Spin Cycle to use in the project, and it should have been enough, but because I did extend the yoke, and I think I also might have extended the body, it definitely extended the yoke. I don't know, I don't remember the body. I obviously ended up using more yarn, so I did end up running out of yarn on the second sleeve, but I have a lot of Spin Cycle scraps from other projects in my stash, so these last 3 rows where it's like a pinky yellow color are just some scraps. Like when you look at it up close, there is quite a jog, but I think in the grand scheme of the project, it's really not noticeable, especially because there are like similar colors in other parts of the sweater, and I think it just blends in. One thing to note, one thing I've been contemplating is I watch some podcasters and I enjoy that they share what a project cost them. And one thing I've noticed is, one, I don't think any of the people who I've seen do this are in the US, and I do find that yarn tends to be a little bit more expensive in the US. And number 2, the people who I watch who do this tend to knit like the smallest or like next to smallest size of a sweater, so naturally that is going to consume less yarn and cost less than somebody who knits a bigger size. And I tend to knit projects that are like in the middle of a size range. If it's like a size inclusive range, I tend to be towards the middle. So I thought it might be interesting if I started including that information, but maybe it's not really interesting or relevant, or maybe it will make me feel guilty if some of the projects that I knit are more expensive, with more expensive yarns. But also a lot of the projects are not. I don't know. Is that interesting information to include? Oh, and another thing when it comes to like the price cost of yarn that I was thinking of when I was like finishing up this project is that I consider this to be like a very luxurious yarn project, But as I live by the motto, ball on a budget, I think this is still like, even though I did use the yarns recommended in the project, I still think I still think the cost of my sweater is still less than half of what it would be if I had like bought one of the kits in my size to make this sweater. That's because I'm pretty sure every single yarn that I used in this project I bought on sale. The Fua Fua Brooklyn General Store always has a summer sale. I bought this last summer. Yeah, I'm pretty sure last summer or spring. They usually have like 15 to 20% off. And then the Spin Cycle yarn I also got on sale from the local yarn store in New Jersey during New Jersey Wool Walk. I also bought it before Spin Cycle did their like last price increase, so it was cheaper. And then the Pearl Silver Goodwill is not expensive to begin with for my budget. And then when you put the sale on top of it, it's like basically $1 more than Cascade 220, which I think a lot of people consider as like the affordable non-superwash wool option in the US. One last thought I had on this sweater. So I can only speak for, let's say, sizes 4. I'll say I made like a size 4.5. I can only speak for my size and below, but I think this would be a nice sweater to make if you wanted to have a sweater that has hand-dyed yarn all over, but you did not want to buy a sweater quantity of hand-dyed yarn, because first of all, you could easily sub in a fingering weight yarn for this pattern because of the tighter gauge. So for the contrast color, 1 skein of fingering weight superwash merino, non-superwash merino, like as long as you had 400 yards of that hand-dyed yarn, you could sub it in for the Spin Cycle. And then for the fluffy yarn, 1 skein of mohair. I think Surrey might be cutting it a little bit close. You might have to have 2 skeins of Surrey for my size, but 1 skein of mohair, 1 skein of fingering weight hand-dyed yarn, and then sub in like whatever main color you want. You could use Goodwill, you could use Cascade 220 fingering, you could use drops, and you would have a sweater that has that hand-dyed yarn all over the sweater with only 2 skeins of hand-dyed yarn, which for me, I would say is a good deal if you want to buy and have the budget for hand-dyed yarn. Okay, I think that is that on this sweater. I'm really looking forward to wearing it and vlogging it in honestly like just a few weeks. Then again, September is usually still pretty hot here. Okay. My next finished object is another one that I talked about in my previous podcast. It is cardigan number 9 by My Favorite Things Knitwear. And I mean, it's not 100% done because again, I have not blocked it because of the weather thing. So after I block it, I will put in the buttons and then it will be truly done. So this is a worsted weight saddle shoulder cardigan and knit top down. It's knit on 5mm needles. To be honest, I probably should have knit this on 5.5mm needles to hit gauge with my yarn choice, but I was traveling when I got the yarn and started the project, and I already bought the 5mm needles, and I didn't want to spend like $16 on another needle tip that I already had at home. So the yarn that I used for this was Derorum Natura Gilead in the shade Poivre et Sel, which I think is salt and pepper, and I did buy it when I was in Paris. This is my first time trying Derorum Natura and this specific yarn base, and I really like it. It is a non-superwash merino. I don't think it's as soft as if you buy hand-dyed non-superwash merino. I think that merino tends to be like the micron, I always forget, is it lower micron count is softer? Hand-dyed non-superwash merino is definitely softer than this, but I would still say for me, this is soft. I totally get why people love this wool. Also, it has a really good yardage. For 100 grams for a worsted weight yarn, you get 250-ish yards, I want to say. And I used just a little bit over 4 balls of yarn, so I'm glad I did buy that 5th ball of yarn. I don't really know if I have anything else to say about it. It's like just like a very classic cardigan. The saddle shoulder definitely reminds me of like some of the cardigans that I saw like influencers wearing on Instagram, which is why I picked this pattern. I think the only real modification I did is on the button band. So I had been toying with the idea of knitting a double knit button band, but I think when you do it with the really thick wool, it can sometimes cause a button band to bulge, especially if you do not sew in the buttons the correct way. So I kind of nixed that idea and I just went with the button band as written in the pattern. However, what I did do is I modified the type of buttonhole that's used. Pretty sure the type of buttonhole that's used is an eyelet buttonhole. I'm like 90% sure. Either way, it is a type of buttonhole where the buttonhole is worked over only one stitch, and it's usually like a rib stitch or a purl stitch in the ribbing. And what that does is when your cardigan is unbuttoned, that row of purl stitches just gets stretched and stretched and stretched and stretched when you're not wearing it, and I just didn't really like the look of that, and I have knit that type of buttonhole in the past and I've dealt with that problem because I think in the sample my favorite things knitwear uses like a long button, so I guess it's not as bad, but I bought like round pearly buttons, which I will insert a picture of because they're not in my vicinity right now. So yeah, I wanted to modify the buttonhole, but I also didn't want to do one of those buttonholes where you're like constantly cutting and joining the yarn because it's so annoying. And what I ultimately found while looking up on Google is the one row buttonhole. So I think this buttonhole just looks really, really clean. And there were a few tutorials that I found for it, but the easiest I found to follow was from the Chili Dog, which I will link below. What I really like about this buttonhole is that you can control how, like the length of it, how many stitches you want to work it over. I decided to work it over 3 stitches because you want it to be spacious, but you don't want it to be bigger than the button because you don't want like the button to be floppy, you know? I worked it on the wrong side because that's what the Chili Dog suggested for it to look clean, and I really, really like the way it looked. I think it really does a good job of mimicking the buttonholes on store-bought sweaters, or just like I recently learned how to sew a buttonhole, and I think this type of buttonhole just mimics that better than a eyelet buttonhole or like one stitch buttonhole. The only problem is there's also a buttonhole on the neckline, and as you can see, the neckline is perpendicular to the button band. So this buttonhole is horizontal and these are vertical. I had spent a little bit of time Googling if there was like a way I could make a vertical button band in a horizontal rib stitch, but I couldn't really find any answers, and I decided it really was not that noticeable, so it was not going to bother me. And again, I have not blocked this out, so hopefully when I block it out, I can like straighten this part so it lines up. And yeah, I think that's all I have to say about this cardigan. I would definitely knit this pattern again, and I'm kind of really tempted to knit one in the exact same color that My Favorite Things knitwear use. I think it's like Gepard Garn Woollia, which is still on my like the top of my wish list of yarns I want to use, and possibly knitting for Olive Mohair, but I might get, if I do end up knitting it in the future and buying the Gepard Garn yarn, I'd probably also buy their Kids Set of Mohair because I tried it. Like I touched it in store every time I saw it while I was traveling, but I didn't end up buying any because just didn't need a sweater quantity of mohair. But maybe once I work through some of my stash, I'll get it. Okay, my last finished object is a one that I had not cast on during my last episode. I actually cast this on my birthday, and then I finished it in like basically exactly 2 weeks, and it wasn't even something I was like exclusively working on because I was also I also knit the button band and collar on the cardigan number 9 while I was working on this. Okay, so I'm not going to talk too much about this sweater because I actually think I want to talk about it more in my next podcast episode after the pattern is released, because this is a test knit. is the California sweater. The color looks kind of weird because I didn't block this yet, and then I'm gonna block it and sew it down. This is a basic drop shoulder sweater pattern by Knit California, who also has a podcast here on YouTube. So this is her first garment pattern. It is a very, very straightforward drop shoulder sweater, knit top down, and it was inspired by the Lento sweater, which if you follow any knitters on YouTube, on Instagram, I don't really follow people on TikTok, but I'm assuming TikTok too, you've probably heard of the Lento sweater. It's a raglan sweater knit with a strand of fingering and I think suri, but it's knit at a very, very loose gauge on 6mm needles. So you get a really light, airy sweater that doesn't consume a lot of yarn, and it's just, I guess, not as like, usually if you're knitting on 6mm needles, you're probably using like an Aran or bulky weight yarn. Naturally, fingering and mohair is lighter than that. So you get light, airy, and you're using less yarn for that sweater. So that sweater is really well known, but she wanted to make a similar sweater in a different construction, so she made this drop shoulder sweater. And I have always been intrigued by the idea of knitting a Lento, but I don't necessarily love the look of raglan sweaters on me, so I never got around to it. So when she was sharing this on her podcast, I was like already eagerly awaiting the pattern to drop, and then when she had the tester call, I was like, I already have yarn in my stash so that I can make this. So then I applied and I got it and I knit it. I would say actually this is a really, really beginner friendly sweater because there's no short row shaping. The neckline and the sleeves are all just shaped with increases and decreases, so totally manageable. And that's on the construction. So the yarns that I used, it's actually interesting because I think with an open gauge sweater, okay, like a sweater with a very, very loose gauge, you can see how different yarns of the same weight knit up, because I think the fabric that I have from a fingering weight and a lace weight is actually quite, it's not a dense fabric, but it's denser than what other people are coming up with and what I'm actually knitting on myself with a different fingering weight and lace weight combination. The lace weight that I'm using is Playful Day Yarns Suri from her Hydrangea collection in the shade. Why does Siri do that? Siri's always listening. No Siri. Okay. As I was saying, the lace weight yarn that I'm using is Playful Day Yarns Suri in the color Firefly from the Hydrangea collection. And if you've knit with Suri and you've knit with mohair, you probably know, okay, Suri is thicker than mohair. And then the wool that I'm using, I think it's technically sold as a sport weight, but it is 400 yards to 100 grams. So that yardage is more similar to a fingering weight yarn. It is a Corriedale yarn by Acre Farms, who are a farm up in Vermont. They have their own Corriedale flock, and then they spin up this yarn and dye it, and they come to VKL every year, which is where I bought this yarn. I really, really, really like the hand feel of this yarn and just how like springy and bouncy it is. There was a little bit of vegetable matter in the yarn, which I always like because it's like I feel like I'm closer to the sheep that way. I really, really enjoyed the yarn, and I will definitely go back and buy another sweater quantity in the upcoming VKL. This yarn combo just like really fills in all the gap, and I really like the more opaque fabric that I'm getting with it. I did have an issue with dye lots because I initially bought 4 skeins. I mean, I think you can see it even on camera. I initially bought 4 skeins of the wool in the 2023 VKL, and then I realized that I don't think that's enough for a sweater quantity. So this year I took like a little piece of the yarn that I bought and I brought it back to see if I can find a color match, and I mean, it's not a perfect color match, but it's pretty close. And I mean, I wasn't expecting the same dye lot after 1 year. So what I ended up doing is that one skein that I had that was darker, I just used it on the bottom ribbing. Actually, on the second sleeve, I ran out of yarn a little bit early. So I did end up having to do like the last few rows of stockinette in the darker wool, but I don't really think it's that noticeable. So it's fine. And I'm just remembering that I said I wouldn't talk too much about this sweater until next episode when the pattern's released. So that's all I'm gonna say about it now. I will talk about it again in the next episode. That's all my finished objects. So let us move on to works in progress, and I guess I should talk about the other test knit on my sweater, on my needles. Yeah, I took a long break from test knitting, and then I was like, I'm only gonna take on one test knit at a time, and then these patterns just kept coming out that I wanted to knit, and the deadline seemed manageable. I had yarn in my stash, so I said yes to one, then I said yes to two, then I said yes to three, and now I have 3 sweaters due in September. But the good news is I really don't think I'm not stressed about it because I've already finished one, and the second one is also almost done. Okay, so the first of my works in progress is the Norfolk sweater by Iris Makes, and I know I was just talking about like test knits and test knit deadlines. I will say, if you do not like being stressed about test knit deadlines, I highly recommend test knitting for Iris because she's very generous test knitting deadlines. I'm pretty sure this test period started in like April or May, so the fact that I'm not done is like completely my own fault, and this pattern knits up so quickly. I know I will quickly get it finished before the test knitting deadline. She actually originally had the deadline in August, but she ended up extending it, so I was like, okay, let me put it on break and finish up some other stuff. This is another top-down sweater. So this has a contiguous sleeve construction, I want to say. I really like the shaping of this sweater. I think it looks really elegant. So as you can see, the increases kind of like mimic the arm line, like where your shoulder and body meet. Your shoulder, is that a weird way to phrase it? The contiguous sleeve, it mimics your anatomy. That's how I will say it. And I think it just looks really clean. I did mess it up because I was not paying the right amount of attention when I was knitting it. So the one thing about contiguous sleeve constructions, I think they look really nice, but you do have to pay attention because you are not increasing at even intervals, and you're not always increasing at the same spot on each section. And I'm the kind of person, if I miss an increase, I'm just like, let me just like add a make one here, add a make one there. I'll just fudge it. And with a contiguous sleeve construction, that can sometimes mess up the flow of the design, but I really don't think it's that noticeable. You still get the line, and especially in this darker color, and when I block it out and when I'm wearing it, I don't think it's going to be noticeable. That's a complete, that is a me mistake. That is not a pattern mistake. Besides for the contiguous sleeve construction, which I already told you I love, the other reason I really like the construction of this sweater is because it just has a really nice rhythm to it. The color charts are very manageable. They're not that wide, like each chart repeat, and they're also not that long. So whenever I reach the colorwork section, I'm like, okay, I'm just gonna keep knitting until I finish the colorwork section, because it's really not that many rows. And then after I finished the colorwork section, you have some sections with a garter stitch. And when I would get to those sections, I'm like, these sections aren't that long. I should just get through them so I can get to the next colorwork section. And basically like one day I would knit all the colorwork, then the next day I would knit all the garter stitch, and then the next day I would knit all the colorwork, then the next day I would knit all the garter stitch. So all in all, the sweater body only took me a week. I think I also forgot to mention that it's knit on 5.5mm needles, so it's quite a large gauge too, which helps it go by quickly. This colorwork I would say is very beginner friendly because, like I mentioned, it's not that long. I don't think there's that many rows where you have to catch floats, and I don't think there's any rows where I think you're always catching the background color, or you're always catching the foreground color, which I think is easier than catching the background color. If you know 200 colorwork, then you know what I'm talking about. It's getting dark. Okay, I'm gonna try to talk quickly. Okay, so I think that's all my notes on the construction. The yarn that I'm using, the main color, the like hot pink color, this is on camera, it's not the most color accurate, so I will try to insert a better picture, is Wool Dreamers Moda, which I love the feel of this yarn too. It's sold at a DK weight, but I honestly think it works up as worsted Aran easily, similar to the Dura Natura Gilead. But the yarns do feel quite different. That I found is really fun. I was on the Will Dreamer site and I found that the sheep that they use to make this, the sheep fleece that they use to make this yarn comes from the Manchego sheep, who also make Manchego cheese, which I thought was really cute. And I also bought some of their other Manchego wool, which I will talk about in Acquisitions. So that is the main color, and then for my contrast color, I'm using two different hand-dyed wools that I bought a year apart, so I really was not planning on them to match so perfectly, and they're both bought at the New Jersey Wool Walk. They're like these soft, like peachy colors. So this is a plant dyed DK weight non-superwash wool, and then this is like a standard silk mohair. This one is dyed by Lavender Fiber Co, and then this one is dyed by a local New Jersey dyer, but I couldn't really find any information on who they are, and the yarn store that I bought it from closed. So this is just a mystery plant dyed wool, and the colors honestly could not have worked out better. I'm not worried about running out of yarn on either of these, but I am playing a bit of yarn chicken with my main color. Good news is that's the only yarn that I'm using that is commercially dyed, so I can easily get another ball of that. As is, this is like about 2 balls of yarn. I'm just into my 3rd ball of yarn. This yarn goes a long way too. That is my first work in progress. I'm really like in a color work mood because my next work in progress is another color work project. My next work in progress is the framed sweater by Andrea Mowry. This is this year's Rhinebeck sweater, and this time I am absolutely determined to finish the sweater for Rhinebeck. Even if I don't wear it the whole day at Rhinebeck, I just want it to be done by then. And you might notice that mine looks a little bit different than other people's projects. So this pattern is written bottom up. But after the fiasco with my tessellated sweater, I decided to modify this to be a top-down sweater, and so far I have no regrets. It looks so good on camera. I just finished wet blocking it because I wanted to see how much it was growing and the length and all that stuff. Instead of starting from the bottom and working up, I really hope this is not too dark. I am recording later in the day than usual, but there's like an hour until sundown. So what I did is I did a provisional cast on 4 times over because I didn't want to lose the 3-needle bind off detail at the shoulders. So I basically provisional cast on for the front, right front, provisional cast on for the left front, provisional cast on for the back right, provisional cast on for the back left, and then I tried to basically follow the directions in reverse. And I also modified the neckline a little bit because I like more of a crew neck neckline, and I think the original pattern is kind of like a crew neck, but it's also kind of similar to her weekender sweater, which is a boat neck, which I really don't like the look of on me. This is kind of like a side tangent rant, but I wish that Ravelry had better search functions because that project has more than that pattern has more than 16,000 projects. So I am sure there are people who have knit that pattern and modified it to be a crew neck instead of a boat neck. However, I tried like several different searches and I just wasn't getting any results. So Ravelry, if you could please improve your search capabilities, that would be much appreciated. So yes, I modified the neckline a little bit. I changed how I started the shoulders, and I do think I ended up knitting my ribbing a little bit longer because there is no ribbing gauge listed in the pattern. So as far as like the length of what the sections are supposed to be, I was just kind of like guessing, going on vibes. Oh, I'm also knitting this at a completely different gauge and yarn weight than the pattern suggests because I wanted to knit this with the yarn in stash. So this is knitted at a worsted weight gauge technically, but I think it's like a 21 stitch gauge, which stranded colorwork, worsted weight, that gauge, I feel like the fabric for me would just be really dense. So I instead am knitting it at a sport weight gauge. I don't think I've hit 21 stitches. I haven't measured my gauge again after blocking this. My gauge is definitely tighter, but I think it's just a more comfortable fabric for me, especially if I do end up wearing it to Rhinebeck, because it's usually not that cold that time of year, especially like in recent years. The reason that the pattern is called framed is because you have two colors for the color work and then you have one color framing it, but I just have decided to ditch that framing color, and I'm just using one main color in the color work and in all the ribbing bits. So my main color is this like dark bluish green. It is Kelburn Woolens and Dora in the shade Evergreen. This yarn is a Highland Wool Merino Mohair blend. I'll put the exact percentages on the screen. This is a really nice yarn. This is my first, no, this is actually my second time working with this yarn, because I initially started knitting a t-shirt with it before realizing I didn't want that t-shirt. This is another yarn that I actually bought during the New Jersey Wool Walk, and it was a great deal. It was, so this was like 2 years ago. The yarn has increased in price. It was $10 back then. It is $12 now. And on top of that, I got it for 40% off for the New Jersey Wool Walk. It was like a clearance find. So I bought 5 balls of yarn for $30, which I think is a great deal, and hopefully will be enough for this sweater. So that's my main color. And then for my contrast color, the color changing spin cycle color, I'm using spin cycle dyed in the wool in the shade Love Spell, which is like a soft pastel-y color. It has pinks and yellows and blues and turquoises. It sounds kind of rainbowy. I don't know, it's just giving like pastel sherbet vibes. And there's somebody I follow on Instagram. Her name is, the account's name is Margot Chien, I think. I apologize for the pronunciation. Okay, hopefully that's a little bit brighter. So as I was saying, this Instagram account, like every single project that they knit, they basically use spin cycle with some sort of fluffy yarn. Sometimes it's like, I think Diamond Lane Birdie, sometimes it's La Bien Aimée Surrey, but their thing is fluffy yarn plus color changing yarn, and I just think it looks so beautiful and interesting and luxurious. But naturally, mohair is expensive, spin cycle is expensive. I just have never gotten around to doing a project in that yarn combination until now. Yeah, all the yarn that I'm using in this project I already had in stash. So like I said, the spin cycle is Love Spell, and then for my mohair, I'm basically just using like a random light pink mohair that I had in stash. I didn't have a sweater quantity of any of these. I just have like single skeins. So instead of going out and buying a sweater quantity, I have been knitting with it, and then when I'm reaching the end of one ball, I will start helically knitting the next ball of mohair that I have that is not the exact same color, but it's so similar that once it's knit up, you cannot tell. So that is how I could justify knitting a spin cycle mohair sweater without breaking the bank. And yeah, I'm just like obsessed with looking at it in pictures and in the viewfinder. I think it looks so pretty. I am a little bit afraid that it is going to be too tight on me, but I'm not going to think too much about that right now. Oh, I have one more sweater work in progress. My last sweater work in progress is one I'm going to talk about very quickly, and if you want to hear more about it, you can watch my last podcast episode. This is the Ava cardigan by Petite Knit. I want to say this is also a contiguous sleeve construction, but at this point I'm just so confused by the names, because I've seen people say contiguous sleeve, I've seen people say European shoulder, I've seen people say other things. I don't know, because Petite Knit has a lot of like her newer patterns, like the Leon sweater. I think she has like the Olga jacket, Maggie cardigan, this one, Poppy Tea. They use different types of shoulder construction, and I'm not 100% sure which is which. All that to say, I do like the way that this shoulder construction fits. Similar to the Norfolk sweater, it like mimics your anatomy. I modified this sweater to be knit in the round and steeked. Essentially, I knit it to pattern, and then when I reached the point where I was separating the sleeves from the body, I cast on 7 extra stitches to join it in the round. 2 of the stitches, the 2 outer stitches I'm knitting as purl stitches, and then the center stitches I am knitting as knit stitches, and I'll just cut down the middle and fold it back on purl stitches. That is the plan. I've never properly steeked anything that I haven't grafted, so we'll see how it goes. Oh my god, it's getting so dark. I technically also have 2 sock project whips, so I will talk about those really quickly. Okay, here is my first sock project whip. It is a self-striping sock. The yarn is from Tiny Human Knit in the Ponyo colorway, and this is actually a second skein, but I think she does such a good job dyeing that even the second skein honestly looks perfect to me. See, I have knitted to have an afterthought heel. I tried a 3x1 ribbing for the first time and I really like it. It's super stretchy, and the less purling stitches I have to do on small circumference on tiny needles, the happier I am. And then for the toe, I just followed my favorite go-to vanilla sock pattern, which is Summerlee's I'm So Basic Socks. So I did the toe from that pattern, and I think the reason I've just been putting off doing the heel is afterthought heels don't fit me very well, but I have been looking at some other patterns where it's an afterthought heel, but they kind of add like a little gusset to it to add some space. So I just have to like find the willpower to dedicate like a few hours to do that one weekend. Shouldn't be too bad. That sock. I'm not gonna say anything more. Here is the ball of yarn, because I think it's really fun to look at self-stripping yarn in the ball and the contrast color. And yes, I am still working on Yarnia's Sock Bingo. If you didn't see my last episode, Yarnia is one of my local yarn stores. This summer they put out a sock bingo board. Each board has a different sock technique, and if you get bingo or if you flip the board, there's different prizes, and anybody can join. You don't have to be local. You just have to go through their website and do it. Okay, sock project 1 down. Let me get sock project 2. Project 2 has barely been cast on, but here it is. I'm actually knitting it on 2 circulars, but I just put it on 1 circular so it would be easier to show. So this is actually the second sock of a pair. This is a pattern from 52 Weeks of Socks volume 1. It has like a cable pattern on it and I really like it. It kind of reminds me of Ivy. It's just I don't really enjoy doing cables on socks because the stitches slip around, and I prefer to cable without a cable needle, but I just can't with socks because the stitches slip. So I do have to use a tiny cable needle, which I find marginally annoying. I really didn't follow the sock pattern for this. I basically knit my go-to like stitch count on the socks, heel, flap, and gusset, and I just added in the cable chart from the pattern onto the front half of the sock. The back half is all stockinette. I actually knit the sock back in March, and then after I knit this sock, it like killed my sock mojo. Only reason I have cast this on is because it will fulfill a square on my sock bingo board. So hopefully this will be a finished sock by next episode. That is the end of my works in progress, and it's getting really dark, but I'm going to talk about my acquisitions and my future knitting plans very quickly, even if this lighting is making me look hella red because it's so dark. So one of my local yarn stores, local-ish yarn stores, Knit Tapestry up in northern New Jersey, had a summer yarn sale, and it was like that Spy Kids meme when they posted a preview of the sale, and I was like zooming in to see, is that what I think it is? So I went up there and it was what I thought it was, so I did get some yarn. Here she is. This is Wool Dreamers Mantelope in, I don't know the name of the colorway off the top of my head, so I put it on the screen. It is the dark brown color. This is that other yarn that I was talking about that is also made from the sheep that make manchego cheese, hence the name Mantelope. And this yarn was 40% off as part of their summer sale, and they had basically sweater quantities of every single colorway. So the fact that I only bought 1 sweater quantity, I think is a real testament to my self-control and my dedication to my low buy. I really love knitting with unspun wool, but it's just not something I can knit with in the summer. So as soon as it gets colder, I'm going to get back into my unspun wool projects, including this one. And I'm going to talk about what I plan on knitting with this, but first let me talk about the 2 other things I picked up during the sale. So they had a whole table full of books and back issues of Rhinebeck magazine that were on sale for $10, and I had like a little bit of decision paralysis with the Rhinebeck magazines, so I didn't end up getting any of those. However, I did end up getting 2 books. First is Crochet Crush, which no, I cannot crochet, but I really love the patterns in this book, and I would like to learn to crochet at some point, and then I will make them. There's like some, I really like the homeware patterns in this book. There's some rugs, like look at this, rugs or blankets, as well as like there's a floral pillow. I would love to make some of these patterns in the future when I do learn how to crochet. And like $10 for a book of patterns for a new book, that's too good of a deal for me to pass up. And then the second book is one that's been on my wish list for even longer. It is Worsted, which is the Rhinebeck curated pattern book. So all the patterns in this book are knit with their Corey Worsted yarn, and it's all different designers. It's just curated by the creator of Rhinebeck, and there's quite a few patterns in this book that I really like. I think my number one is a one by Sylvia Watts Cherry. It's an intarsia pattern. I think that is so beautiful, and I'd love to knit it eventually. I don't have any like concrete plans on when I will knit it, but it will be knit at some point. And again, like $10 for so many patterns, when I think that the original price of this is like $40 or $50. I cannot resist. Manifesting that I eventually find their Neons and Neutrals book on sale at some point. It doesn't have to be $10, but even though you do get so many patterns for what the price of the book is, it's just, I don't know, there's like a mind block. So on to a very brief future plan section. So this yarn, I plan on knitting one of the Amy Christopher's mosaic knitting patterns, either the pressed flowers pullover or her newly released cardigan, whose name I don't remember off the top of my head. And for my contrast color, I want to use Pale September by Spin Cycle, which is their store exclusive colorway for La Mercerie. And I've had this yarn in stash for 2 years, and I keep trying to knit it with different contrast colors, and it just never quite right. Because this has contrast with every single color that's present in that shade of Spin Cycle, I think it'll work out. I don't know how soon I will cast that on. I know Spin Cycle is having a cal for the patterns for the cardigan pattern and like the collection that cardigan pattern was released in, but I think those go on for some time. I don't think I'm gonna be casting this on in August or even September, maybe October. Let's say maybe October. And then my next cast on is my third test knit of the moment. It's another open gauge sweater knit on 6mm needles with fingering weight yarn and with lace weight yarn, and I actually found 2 options in stash for this. So when I saw this tester called, this pattern is the Metropolitan Pullover by Tori Yu. I knew that I wanted to knit it with Fua Fua because basically I had bought sweater quantities of each of these colors of Fua Fua, but then I went on to use 1 skein, or in the case of this one, a little bit over 1 skein, as contrast colors in other projects. So then I was left with kind of like an odd amount, and I wasn't really sure what to do because the yarns are quite expensive and I didn't really want to buy another skein. I was looking for patterns that basically use less yardage, and the Metropolitan Pullover totally does. For my size, it uses less than 900 yards, which is perfect for the amounts that I have of both of these. So this one, the pink, I used in my tessellated pullover. I have basically just enough. I think I have like 10 yards more than the recommended amount if I knit it with this color. And then the pink, I do have like 100 more yards than the recommended amount. But the thing is, so the 4th skein of this that I have, that's in a different project, the twig sweater, I have not finished knitting that sweater. So I don't know if I will need more of this to finish that. That's my only hesitancy. I mean, I think based on the yardage recommendations and looking at other people's project pages, I should be fine. But just in case, that's why I have not knit with this yet. And then the yarns that I want to hold with it. Okay, so for the colorway Flamingo, I have the Kinross 4-ply in the shade Posy, and people do say this one feels like cashmere once blocked. It's kind of funny because in the skein it almost feels like a wool cotton blend. 70% cashmere, 30% merino. So that is color option 1, and then color option 2 is Rose Quartz, which is a soft pink, and then I would do like a very subtle scrappy version with Knitting for Olive Merino and Santa Scarn Sunday, and I would just alternate skeins. I don't know, it would just be like a very, very subtle, scrappy, soft pink sweater. So if you were me, which one would you do? The brighter pink flamingo or the lighter pink rose quartz? They both have their pros and cons. That is the end of this episode. I really hope this is not too dark. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I would love to know what you are working on while you watch this video, because I'm a nosy bee and I love to know that information. I've also kind of been thinking of, a lot of times like when I'm looking at the comments, I'll find like a new knitting pattern that I hadn't seen before or I had forgot about or whatever, and I like add it to my Ravelry project, my Ravelry favorites. And sometimes there's like multiple patterns. So I thought about maybe including a section at the end of each podcast where I like feature one of my favorite patterns from the previous podcast's comments. That might be interesting. If you do want to see those future podcasts, feel free to like and follow along. For my next video, I'm thinking, I have like 2 ideas percolating. One is trying to decide what sweater I want to knit for Rhinebeck, because I know I have that framed sweater, but I also kind of want to knit like my own Rhinebeck sweater, and I want to pick a vintage pattern. That is video idea number 1. It'll be kind of like a pattern roundup, but it also kind of be, I'll probably end up showing like what yarns and stash I would use if I were to knit those patterns. And I'll probably like also share color inspiration, and if there's any other project pages on Ravelry that have like interesting colors, or sometimes there's not even any projects on Ravelry, or if there's like also some ready to wear sweaters that are similar to these patterns that I could get inspiration from. So that's video idea number 1. And then video idea number 2 is for summer. I had created a mood board of things, like a general inspiration of things I would like to sew and knit, and I didn't follow through on it at all. But I was thinking maybe I would make one for fall, and it would be kind of like a casual video where I'm basically showing and talking through the process of how I'm making the mood board, and like sharing the mood board, I guess, as like a whip from the start, as a whip from the start to finish, if that makes sense. And I'm also going to try to record these podcasts a little bit more frequently. I think right now I'm like every 5-ish weeks, and I think that just gets a little bit stressful. This is a lot of ramblings for a closeout, so I will shut my mouth now and just say thank you again for watching. Hope to see you again next time. Until then, happy knitting. Bye bye.